Welcome back to Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we embark on the next segment of Dharma Talks by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, Geoffrey DeGraff. Join us as we delve into these profound teachings. Carefully compiled by our team, this audiobook serves as a conduit for Buddha's wisdom. Your support in sharing these teachings is invaluable. Subscribe, like, and share to extend their impact. Together, let's enrich the world with Buddha's timeless guidance. Relax and absorb the essence of these teachings as we begin our exploration today. A soiled oily rag. 3 Perceptions in Context, April 20, 2009. Back when I was with Ajahn Fuang, this is after I had started translating some of Ajahn Lee's books and sending them around. A group of people in Singapore who had received some of the books started a correspondence. One of the first letters we got from one of the members of the group was from a bank official who was saying that his practice of meditation was to see everything in terms of the 3 characteristics, that everything was inconstant, stressful and not self. Whether he was at work, meditating, watching the TV, whatever, he was trying to see everything in terms of those 3 characteristics. I read this to Ajahn Fuang, translating it for him. And he said, write back and tell him to look at what it is that's saying those things are inconstant, stressful and not self, because the problem lies with that part of the mind. In other words, just seeing those things in terms of those 3 perceptions is not enough. We have to use those perceptions within the larger context for the practice, which is the 4 Noble Truths. Turn around and look at what it is that wants to crave those things, wants to desire those things. Because the reason we look at them as inconstant, stressful and not self, is to remind us that you can't find any true happiness in them. They change. They're stressful while they change. And you don't have any ultimate control over them, so why would you want to try to build a happiness based on those things? What kind of happiness could you get based on those things? It's bound to wobble. It's bound to fall apart. We have to keep hammering this message into the mind because it's always looking for happiness in terms of those things. And you have to keep reminding it, no, that's not where happiness is found. For happiness to be true, it would have to be something long-term with no stress, and not outside of your control. These are the reflections that lead to the question that the Buddha said is the beginning of wisdom. What when I do it will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? My long-term welfare and happiness. The 3 perceptions are related to those 3 parts of that question. If something is inconstant, it can't be long-term. If it's stressful, it can't be your ultimate welfare and happiness. And if it lies outside of your control, it's not yours. So you're trying to train that part of the mind that's looking for happiness. You're trying to develop a sense of dispassion around the raw materials from which you usually build your sense of the world, your sense of who you are, and the happiness that you're going to find in the world. Ajahn Mahabua compares these 3 perceptions to a stick for beating the hand of a mischievous monkey who always likes to grab things. As it reaches out to grab something, you hit it with a stick and say, no. It reaches out again, you hit it again. Until finally, it realizes it can't hold on to those things. When you see that these things can't provide a true happiness, the other question is, where else are you going to look? This is where the role of conviction in the practice comes. That if we learn how to let go of these things, there will be a true happiness. In other words, you're sticking with that original question. What when I do it will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? We're not giving up on the idea of true happiness. We're not saying, well, I guess I should just accept things as they are, and not try to have any unrealistic desires for anything lasting or true. That's not the kind of teaching the Buddha would give. He's just telling us, you're looking in the wrong place. This is why the duty with regard to the first noble truth is that we should comprehend it. We're trying to comprehend what suffering is, so that we can stop looking to it for happiness, so that we can start looking someplace else. To comprehend suffering includes comprehending what causes it. Because suffering includes clinging that comes from a combination of clinging and craving, you've got to look at why you want to continue to crave these things. As Ajahn Suwat once said, we crave these things because we like them. Our likes and dislikes get in the way. So look very carefully at what you actually get out of these things. The Buddha said to look both for the arising and passing away of these things, and then for their allure, the satisfaction, the gratification you get out of them, as well as for their drawbacks. If there weren't some allure, you wouldn't reach for them. You wouldn't grab at them. You wouldn't hold on. And there are many things that we hold on to, but we don't like to admit that we're getting a certain amount of pleasure from them. Anger, for instance. Most people say, "Oh, I don't like my anger. I wish I could get rid of it." Well, one reason you can't get rid of it is because there's a part of the mind that is actually getting a little bit of food, a little bit of nourishment out of the anger. There's some enjoyment that comes with the anger. And if you don't ferret out that part of the mind and see what that enjoyment is, you'll never be able to let go. So that's an important part of comprehending the stress and suffering. To see what incites you to cling in the first place, to keep holding on and to hold on again and again, even as these things keep slipping out of your grasp. Now to do this, you've got to observe the other duties that go along with the Four Noble Truths. In other words, as you're learning to comprehend suffering, there should come a point when the mind realizes, this is not worth it. The image the Buddha gives is of a blind man who has been given a soiled oily rag. The person giving it to him tells him that it's a clean white rag, so the blind man is very protective of it. He folds it up and takes very good care of it because he thinks it's a nice white piece of cloth. Later, when he is treated by a doctor and gets his eyesight back, he can see what it really is. It's just a soiled old rag. So this is why we try to comprehend the five aggregates, the six sense media in terms of those three perceptions. To see that they're just soiled old rags. At the same time, we're looking for where the gratification is in holding on to them or ignorant misunderstanding that there's something of value. Then you want to comprehend the drawbacks of craving these things until you really do develop a sense of dispassion. With the dispassion, you start letting go of the craving. That's the second duty with regard to the Noble Truths. To let go of the cause of suffering. To get the mind in the right place to be able to do this and not feel threatened by the idea of letting go, you develop the path, a healthy sense of self that comes with virtue, the sense of well-being that comes with concentration that also allows you to settle down and look at things clearly. You look first at your other attachments to things aside from the path so that you're ready for the insight that sees, oh, this isn't worth holding on to. All these things that I've identified as mere mine. They're just soiled oily rags. Or like that Far Side cartoon of a cow out in the pasture with a lot of other cows. It suddenly jerks back its head with a startled look on its face, and it spits out a mouthful of grass, saying, "Grass. This is just grass. We've been eating grass." You see that the things you've been holding on to are just that. Grass. Nothing really worth holding on. 2. Especially considering all the effort that goes into trying to create a reliable happiness out of these things. Because ultimately that's what it comes down to. Our attachment comes from the belief that no matter how much effort goes into it, it's worth it, because the happiness outweighs the effort. But when you really look at these things carefully, you begin to see, no, the effort way outweighs the little taste of happiness, the little taste of pleasure that you get from holding on to these things. And having the mind in a good solid state of concentration helps you see that because you've got a more solid state of well-being, a more lasting sense of pleasure, a well-being that can permeate the whole body, so that compared to the pleasure and ease of concentration, these other pleasures are really not worth it. Whereas the effort that goes into the concentration really does pay off. So you work on developing that even further until you get to the point where you're ready to let go of that too. You begin to see that even concentration is composed of aggregates to which you've been holding on to. And the same principle applies. These things arise and pass away too. They're stressful, inconstant, stressful, and you see them as not self. You're not looking at this in terms of some abstract theory of whether there is or is not a self. You're looking at where you're feeding for your pleasure and you realize even this is not worth it. As the Buddha said, If the aggregates didn't give some pleasure, we wouldn't hold on to them. We wouldn't crave them. But we also have to see that there's stress involved in holding on to them as well. Once the aggregates, as they have been shaped into right concentration, have done their work, you no longer need the effort that goes into them. You can let them go. That's when the mind opens up to something that doesn't require any effort at all. The ultimate happiness. Notice that that's not the ultimate equanimity. The Buddha never said nirvana is the ultimate equanimity. He said it's the ultimate happiness. You don't turn your mind into a resigned oatmeal kind of state. You find that by letting go, things open up immensely. No limits of space or time. And no need to put in any effort. As to whether you'd call it a self or not, you don't want to call it a self. You don't want to say, there is no self, because that issue is totally irrelevant. One of the ways of getting to that state is, as the Buddha said, to put aside your ideas about existence or non-existence by just watching things arising and passing away, and seeing them simply as stress arising and passing away. You see that it's just that stress, arising and passing away, so you can let go of it. You let go of any attempt to build a happiness out of those things. Having put the mind into a state where ideas of existence and non-existence are irrelevant, where they just don't occur to you, there's no reason why you'd want to go around banging people over the head with the idea that there is no self, say, or that there is a true transcendent self. There's simply a dimension that lies beyond even the concepts of existence and non-existence, and it can be experienced, it can be touched. That's all that really matters. That's the attainment we're working toward. All these teachings have their strategic purpose. And it's important that we keep using them for their strategic purpose. We're not here to argue, we are not here to establish the one right view about reality. We're here to find ways of putting an end to suffering. So remember those three perceptions. And that's what the Buddha called them, perceptions. The perception of inconstancy, the perception of stress, the perception of not self. He never called them characteristics. He never talked about three characteristics. You do a search for the term, three characteristics in the Pali Canon, and you're not going to find it. The Buddha's talking about a way of perceiving that helps you see through your attachments, that helps you see through your delusions about where you can find happiness, so that the question that lies at the beginning of wisdom, what when I do it will lead to my true long-term welfare and happiness, finally gets its answer in the skills you've developed. And part of the strategy in mastering those skills is to master the tasks that are appropriate to the Four Noble Truths. That's what we're doing. We're working on those tasks so that we can handle them skillfully. We want to skillfully comprehend stress and suffering, so we can understand why it is that we keep feeding on these things, even though they ultimately lead to disappointment. That helps us develop dispassion for the craving that keeps pushing us in that direction, so that we can let it go. At the same time, we're developing the path that puts the mind in a position where it can do this without feeling threatened, until it no longer needs that particular position, that particular center. Then you can take that apart as well. Then when you've arrived at the ultimate happiness, nirvana, you've used the Buddha's teachings for their intended purpose. That's what it's all about. Taking charge. July 21, 2009. The passage we chanted last night. Atana Loko, the world offers no shelter. Anabhisaro, there is no one in charge. When you think about it in one way, it's scary. There is no greater power that you can turn everything over to. There's no guarantee that everything is going to come out all right in the end. That's the scary interpretation. The other interpretation sees this as an opportunity. You're free to choose. You are free to write the story of your own life because there is nobody up there taking down the narrative from their point of view. You can write the story of your life right now. You can write one little bit of it right now. But sometimes that little bit can be very important. It can change the whole plot. If you look back at your past, there are many actions that point in different directions. The story could head off in all kinds of directions from here. And so with each choice, you're deciding which parts of your past are relevant, which parts get stitched into the overall story, and which parts are just extra bits and pieces left over. So what do you want? What kind of life do you want? Now, unfortunately, not everything is totally there for you to make up. There are certain givens in your life. Some things you can't change. And there's also simply the fact of action, the fact of cause and effect. If you want a good life, you have to create the causes for the good life. If you want happiness, you have to create the causes for happiness. It's up to you. As always, freedom entails responsibility. So it's important, as you contemplate your path, that you fully appreciate both sides, both the freedom and the responsibility. Sometimes we underestimate the freedom. We see that our lives have followed certain patterns and we just kind of let them go into the same old ruts over and over again, regardless of where those ruts are going to lead. We don't appreciate the freedom of choice. We have to choose our identity. Every time the mind takes on an identity, that identity is already ready to fall apart, which means that if you've been taking on unskillful identities, you don't have to stick with them. You can change. The thing about change here, though, is that it depends on your actions. This is where the responsibility comes in. You have to be responsible. You have to be totally honest with yourself about what your intentions are, so that you recognize an unskillful one when it comes up. You recognize a skillful one when it comes up. And do your best to strengthen the skillful ones, weaken the unskillful ones. As the Buddha often said, the things you keep thinking about form the inclination of the mind. And so as with any new habit, it takes a while to get used to the new habit. But you can lay down these new patterns in your brain, you can lay down these new patterns in your actions. So you should ask yourself, what kind of life do you want? And then what choices does that kind of life require right now? If you're honest with yourself, you want a life of true happiness, a life that harms nobody. That requires that you develop a lot of qualities in the mind. Mindfulness, alertness, compassion, goodwill, discernment, concentration, conviction in the principle of action. These are going to be related in one way or another to what are called the 5 strengths. For to move your life in the direction you want it to requires strength, especially if you're having to change directions. So you need to have conviction in the principle of action, that your actions really do make a difference. When the Buddha talks about knowing yourself, it's largely knowing your actions. Because your actions are the results of choices that come and go, you can change yourself through changes in your actions. And these changes are important. The choices you make are important. You need to have conviction in that principle. If you're not convinced of the importance of your actions start getting careless. So keep reminding yourself, you're the one in charge. If there's nobody else in charge, you can take charge. And you actually are taking charge each time you make a choice. So you can't abdicate your responsibility, saying, somebody else told me to do this. I am just following orders. The fact that you choose to follow orders is your karma right there. So you need conviction in the principle that your actions are important, and you can change them. It may take time. It may take effort. But they can be changed. The next strength is persistence. You really stick with this. Once you've decided that a certain quality needs to be developed in your mind, you stick with it. You do whatever needs to be done. If you need to work on concentration, just keep coming back to the breath. If you find that certain defilements are getting in the way, you have to work on them, figure out ways to think around them, so you don't constantly follow their song, their voices. So regardless of the quality that needs to be developed in the mind, or whichever one you're focusing on, you've got to keep coming back, to make sure that it's strong, that it really has become a new habit, a new skill. This requires mindfulness, keeping in mind what you've got to do. Mindfulness is always paired with alertness, watching what you're actually doing to see if it does fall in line. This is where the principle of honesty comes in, because there is nobody up there to whom we can turn to give us the final word on what's right and wrong. We have to be really honest with ourselves. When I do X, what are the results? Do they cause harm? Do they not cause harm? Look very, very carefully. This is why, when the Buddha taught Rahula this principle, he first started with the principle of truthfulness. If you're not truthful, he says, there's no quality of a practitioner in you. It's been turned upside down, thrown away. It's empty and hollow. Your own honesty is your one authority, your one refuge. So you keep in mind what you've got to do, and then you keep checking your actions to make sure that they fall in line with that. This is a process that gets more and more subtle as it develops. The duty here is not something imposed from without. When the Buddha talks about duties, the only duties he really describes as universal are the duties appropriate to the Four Noble Truths. He doesn't impose them on you, but once you've decided that you want to put an end to suffering, you've taken on those duties yourself. You want to comprehend the suffering and abandon its cause. So wherever you look in your mind, wherever you look in your actions, make sure that you're following in line with these duties, trying to develop the path. If you find yourself wandering off, okay, more persistent effort is required. And as your effort gets more and more skillful, it moves into right concentration. This is the culmination of your effort to renounce sensuality, to renounce ill will, to renounce harmfulness. When it's really resolved on those things, where else will the mind go but into good concentration? Then as the mind is really concentrated, it's able to be secluded from unskillful mental states. And when unskillful mental states come back, you can see them clearly. This is how concentration fosters discernment. And, in turn, the discernment fosters your concentration. You begin to notice that the way the mind is concentrated is not as effortless as it could be, it's not as refined, it's not as solid as it could be. You work on adjusting those causes, adjusting your choices. Where you focus, how you manipulate the object, like the breath, to get the mind to settle down further. When you know that you've reached the point where you don't need to manipulate it anymore, that you can just be with the breath. All of this requires discernment. So if you look carefully at all 5 of these strengths, you realize that they're very much interconnected. It's not just 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 bingo. Discernment comes back and helps your effort. After all, you need to have some knowledge of what's skillful and not for your right effort to be right on course. Discernment helps your conviction, so that it doesn't go running off into strange ways. The image the Buddha gives is of building a house. You put the rafters up to support the main roof beam, but only when the main roof beam is in place are the rafters solid too. So discernment builds on the other strengths, and then it turns around to make those strengths even stronger by ensuring that they really do work together. So if you're going to be responsible, if you're going to have freedom, you need strength. The strength to make the right decision, the strength to keep on making the right decisions. When you think about that passage, that there's no one in charge, what it means is that here's your opportunity to take charge in your life. It carries responsibilities. You have to be honest. But it also brings a lot of freedom. On a very deep level, there's nobody out there you have to please. You act kindly because it's your choice. You're generous because it's your choice. You're virtuous, you meditate, because it's your choice. So take full advantage of your freedom. Really appreciate the fact that we are free to choose, and that freedom can lead to a freedom going beyond simply the freedom to choose. Absolute freedom, absolutely unlimited. That's the happiness the Buddha promises. But you can find it only if you take charge. Views and Vision. July 29, 2009. The mind spends a lot of its time talking to itself. And so when we come to the practice, it's important that we learn how to use that habit in a skillful way, so that it actually helps the practice and doesn't get in the way. If you've read any of the texts, you know that when the mind gets into deep concentration, the sentences and dialogues that go on in the mind get pared down really far to the point where there's just a mental note, like infinite space, the sana of infinite consciousness. That's all the talking that's going on in the mind. But right now, if you feel harassed by all the chatter going on in the mind, that sounds pretty good. Just hold on to one thought, one object, and get away from all the torment of what's being said inside the mind. But you can't get there until you've learned how to train the mind, how to talk to itself skillfully, what sorts of things are important to talk about, and what sort of things are not, what attitude to take. And unfortunately for most of us, we've learned lots of unskillful ways of talking. If it's not from our family, then it's from school or from the media. We talk about all the wrong topics or talk about things in ways that actually discourage us from practicing either specific ideas about ourselves or attitudes in general. One of the most virulent attitudes going around is the only way you're going to find happiness is through sensual indulgence. You can cite Freud. You can cite all these other psychotherapists as authorities, but then again, what kind of authority are they? It just so happens that their opinions fit in with the needs of the economy. And so those thoughts get pounded into our heads again and again and again. Their idea of what's important to talk about. So we've got to learn how to retrain these voices in our minds, what sort of issues are important to talk about, and what sort of issues are important to just leave aside. And as for the important issues to talk about, how do you talk about them? How do you encourage yourself in the practice? The Buddha recommends 10 topics for recollection for the purpose of giving you energy, counteracting any unskillful chatter in the mind and replacing it with skillful chatter. You can recollect the Buddha to remind yourself that it is possible to find true happiness through human effort. After all, when the Buddha talked about his awakening, he didn't say it was because he was some special being beamed down from the sky. He simply developed qualities of the mind that all of us have in potential form. So that raises our sights as to what we can do with our lives. You can think about the Dharma in that it recommends a totally harmless form of happiness, a happiness that doesn't pose any danger to you, doesn't pose any danger to anybody else, doesn't harm anybody. This is why they recommend that when monks are in the forest and they start getting scared about the dangers in the forest, the animals, the people who might be lurking in the wilderness, the diseases that can come, the fact that you are far away from doctors, anything of any comfort, simply remind yourself you're there in a totally harmless way. And that can give you confidence. You can recollect the Sangha. If comparing yourself to the Buddha seems like a far stretch, you can think, well, there were people who studied with the Buddha who were really like us. Some cases a lot worse off than we are right now. And yet they were able to pull themselves together, gain awakening. So these are recollections to overcome fear and lack of self-esteem. Similarly with the recollection of your virtue, times in the past when you could have harmed somebody or done something against your principles, but you decided not to. Your principles were more important. Think about that. You have worth as a human being because of that. The same when you were generous. For many of us, our first real experience of freedom was when we realized we could give something to somebody else, not because we had to, or it was their birthday or Christmas or anything. Simply because you wanted to share. Something you could have used yourself, but you said no, I want to give it to somebody else. It's good to reflect on that. You can think about the qualities that would make you a diva, things like a sense of shame at the idea of doing something really harmful, other good qualities of the mind. You have those at least to some extent. So reflect on that. Again, these reflections are meant to give you a sense of self-confidence, self-esteem. To remind you that even though you may have done a lot of unskillful things in the past, you do have your skillful potentials. And it's up to you to decide which past actions are the important actions in your life story. We all have a mixed bag in the past. You can think about this as if someone were writing your life story. And if you decide to stick with the skillful path, that means that the skillful qualities you had in the past are the important ones. If you stray away from the skillful path, that means the unskillful qualities, the unskillful things you did in the past are the important ones. So as you shape the present, you're not only shaping the present, but also highlighting different things in your past. So why not highlight the good things? If you find yourself focusing on the bad ones, remind yourself, at least I had some good qualities in the past, and those are the ones that eventually won out. At least they are winning out right now. If a part of your mind retorts, while you may be winning out right now, You're going to lose out further down the line. You respond, I don't care about further down the line. I'm not responsible for further down the line right now. I want to make sure that at least right now I make the right choice. So at least there is a little uptick in the general line of your life. And once you've decided to do that once, you can do it again, and you can do it again, until it becomes a habit. Then there are the reflections to make sure that you don't be heedless and complacent. There's recollection of death. The fact that death could come at any time and that you've got to prepare because death isn't the end. As long as there's craving in the mind, it jumps onto another life. The image the Buddha gave is of a fire burning one house that then jumps across to another house, burns the next house, then the next. So what kind of house are you going to? The image kind of breaks down here, but the craving is what pulls you on. What kind of cravings are you nurturing in your mind right now? What cravings would be more skillful to nurture? What habits do you want to take with you as you go on? You realize there is work to be done in the mind. You can't just put it off to tomorrow or the next day or next week or next month or next year. Because you don't know if you have a next day or a next month or a next year. But you do know that you have right now. This breath coming in and out right now. If it so happened that you suddenly died right now, wouldn't you prefer to be in a moment of mindfulness and alertness, rather than wandering around thinking about who knows what? So that's a recollection to make you more heedful, to help overcome laziness. There's mindfulness immersed in the body, which is to help you remember, do you want to keep coming back as a human being, or would you rather come back as something better? There's always that issue at death when people are really possessive of their bodies. They come back as a spirit hovering around their dead body. Would you like to do that? This body may seem okay while it's alive, but when it's dead, it's really not that attractive a place to be. Can you learn how to develop a sense of detachment from your own body now, so you're not afraid to let it go when you have to? And mindfulness of the breath is a practice for developing all those good qualities that you need to make your aims a reality. Mindfulness, alertness, ardency, concentration, and discernment. This is the recollection that you can make your home. Then finally there's recollection of peace. The peace of nirvana. Remind yourself that this is really the direction you want to go, that there is an attainment of true happiness. Keep reminding yourself of the direction where true happiness lies, so that you don't get distracted by other ideas about happiness. Now if you find yourself having trouble settling down with the breath, you've got these other topics to think about. They should always be there in the background where you can draw on them when you need them. As long as the mind needs to think, have it think about something that's really useful. As long as it's going to talk to itself, make sure the conversation is actually a skillful conversation. Otherwise, you can spend all your time in views, without any vision. It's a distinction the Buddha makes in the Metta Sutta. He describes the ideal meditator as not taken with views, but consummate in vision. We spend most of our time talking about, I think this about that, I think that about this. This is my opinion on politics, this is my opinion on the Michael Jackson feeding fest in the media and whatever. But does it really matter? A while back I was reading Mark Twain's autobiography, and occasionally he talks about political issues of the day. His political opinions are really the least interesting part about Mark Twain. His more interesting opinions are those about the universals of human nature. You should have that attitude towards your own thoughts. Your really interesting thoughts are about the more universal things, particularly this issue of vision, which means that you actually see what the mind is doing, see how it's creating suffering for itself. And this may not be a topic that you can talk about with other people, but at least it doesn't lead to controversy. And it's the most important issue you can talk about with yourself. As the Buddha said, the source of all conflicts in the world comes from a type of thinking he calls papanka, mental proliferation, where your thoughts just get out of control to the point where they come back and attack you, i.e. they put you into difficulties, they create trouble for you. These thoughts come from one basic notion. I am the thinker. You want to establish your identity through your opinions about things. The Buddha did not encourage this kind of thinking. Questions that come from this "Who am I? What am I? What will I be?" are, he said, questions that are inappropriate if you really want to put an end to suffering, because instead of freeing you, they get you more tied up with views and opinions. For instance, the question about what happens to an awakened person after death. Does the person exist? Not exist? Both? Neither? If you're asking these questions because you're worried about what's going to happen to this I who's been doing the thinking, the Buddha wouldn't answer you. He didn't want to encourage that kind of thinking. He wanted to encourage the type of thinking that looks at, is there suffering here right now? Where? What am I doing that's causing the suffering? What can I do to put an end to it? It's interesting to reflect that here we are, learning about ourselves through meditation, but what kind of self-knowledge is this? The questions, who am I? What am I? What was I in the past? What am I going to be in the future? Those questions the Buddha said to put aside. The self-knowledge he was more interested in is, what am I doing right now? What are the results of what I'm doing? What when I do it will be skillful, leading to good results? What when I do it would be unskillful, leading to harmful results? What would be for my long-term suffering? What would be for my long-term happiness? Those kinds of questions are worth asking. In other words, seeing yourself as having the power to create long-term happiness and then asking yourself, how can I develop that potential? But you should also learn to see that you have the potential for creating a lot of harm and suffering, so how can you avoid that potential? That kind of self-knowledge. That's vision. And is really useful. Unfortunately, our society encourages us to have views about things, yet doesn't encourage much vision. But you can train yourself. You can drop the ways that society teaches you to talk to yourself, and train yourself in new ways that point you in the direction of vision. You're not simply a product of social pressures and social influences, because there is something that really is totally yours, which is suffering. No one else can experience your suffering. Nobody knows how much you suffer, how you suffer. That's something only you can know, but you can really know it. And as the Buddha points out, you can also learn how not to suffer. That kind of self-knowledge. That's vision. And you have the freedom to develop that if you want. No happiness other than peace. October 9, 2009. Nathi Santi Param Sukham, there is no happiness other than peace. This saying of the Buddha has an interesting history. Over time, the translation turned from there is no happiness other than peace to there is no happiness higher than peace, which totally changes the meaning. Perhaps people thought that there are other kinds of happiness not related to peace at all, the happiness of winning out over somebody else, the happiness of sensual desire, even the happiness that goes along with being angry. People like to be angry. There's a certain amount of pleasure with that and all the other defilements, and there's certainly no peace there. But if you look carefully, you'll see that even in the defilements there is a moment of rest, a moment of certainty, a moment of settling in, even if just for a second. And sometimes it lasts longer. After all, the Buddha did recognize that it's possible to get into very strong states of absorption based on greed, aversion, and delusion. They're wrong concentration, but they are absorption, and there's an element of peace, an element of stillness there. Whatever pleasure those things contain, it lies in those moments of peace, those moments of certainty. Of course, the problem with those kinds of peace is that they don't last very long, and they're very toxic, because they can lead to all sorts of disturbance afterwards. This is why the Buddha said we have to search for the highest peace together with the highest happiness. They go together. And this is why the search for the highest happiness is not a selfish thing. The Buddha honors our desire for true happiness. Everywhere, he says, this path is for happiness, and we should take our desire for happiness seriously. It's not something we should be ashamed of. We don't have to say, well, I'll delay my own happiness and make other people happy first. That's not the Buddha's approach at all. He says that if you take your search for happiness seriously, and find a happiness that really is reliable, It will take you to peace, to the highest peace where you are not harming anyone anywhere. And in the course of developing that happiness, we have to develop really honorable qualities of mind. There's the wisdom that sees that long-term happiness is better than short-term, and that it has to depend on your actions. That's why the question that lies at the beginning of wisdom or discernment is, what when I do it will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? The wisdom lies in the long term, and it lies in the fact that you recognize you've got to do something for this happiness to come about. Then there's the compassion that comes as a corollary of that, which is you realize that if your peace is going to last, if your happiness is going to last, it has to depend on not causing any harm to anybody else. Otherwise they'll try to destroy it. So you have to take their desire for peace, their desire for happiness into consideration. There's a passage where the Buddha tells King Pasenadi that you can search the whole world over, and you'll find no one who doesn't have fierce love for themselves. You have fierce love for yourself. Everyone else has the same fierce love for themselves. So if your happiness gets in the way of their fierce love of themselves, they're not going to stand for it. There'd be no peace. So you have to look for a happiness that doesn't depend on harming anybody, and that requires purity in your actions. The purity of genuinely causing no harm. You have to look very carefully at your actions. What are you doing that could be causing harm to yourself, harm to other people? It's certainly not wise if you're doing that. And although there may be general instructions about which kinds of actions are harmful and which ones are not, there are a lot of little details that can't be put in books that you have to learn to observe for yourself. So you have to watch each action by watching your intention first, checking that out to see if it's an honorable intention, and then watching your action as you're doing it to see what immediate results it's producing. If it's producing harmful results, stop. If not, you can continue. After you're done, look at the long-term results. If you find out only afterwards that you've caused harm, then you have to make up your mind not to engage in that kind of action ever again, that kind of intention ever again. Then go talk it over with someone whose insight you trust. This is an important part of the Buddha's instruction on what we now call self-knowledge. For him, self-knowledge doesn't mean knowing yourself as a thing, it means knowing yourself in terms of actions. And he provides a context in which you can do this effectively. This is why he set up the monastic Sangha, so we'd have a group of people who are following the Buddha's teachings that anybody can come and consult with and say, I did this, and I got these results. What should I do? In other words, you don't have to reinvent the Dharma wheel every time you find you've made a mistake. You can tap into the knowledge and experience of people who are further along on the path. This is how we develop purity. As the Buddha told Rahula, all those in the past who purified their thoughts, words, and deeds did it in this way. All those in the future who are going to purify their thoughts, words, and deeds will do it this way. And all of those at present who are purifying their thoughts, words, and deeds do it this way. What this means is that if you take your search for happiness seriously, you have to develop wisdom, compassion, and purity, the virtues that are traditionally ascribed to the Buddha himself. This is part of his skill as a teacher to show that if you take your happiness seriously, you have to develop good qualities of mind. It's not a purely hedonistic pursuit, nor are you simply learning how to indulge in pleasure in a sophisticated way. You realize that happiness is something important, and if it really is important, then you have to develop important qualities of mind. As we do this, we find that our actions become less and less harmful, there is less and less cause for conflict. On the one hand, that makes it easier for us to practice. On the other hand, it makes the world a better place to be in general, and in particular, in terms of our thoughts, the world of our own mind becomes better, too, because, of course, our actions and words come out of our thoughts. This is where the Buddha finds the source of conflict to begin with. There's a sutta where Sakka, the king of the Devas, comes down to see the Buddha with some questions to ask him. It's an interesting sutta. It starts out with Sakka trying to get the Buddha in the right mood to talk with the Deva king. So he sends down one of his musicians. It's one of the nicer pieces of humor in the Pali Canon. The musician comes down, he sings a song about the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, and lust. The song is directed to his ladylove, telling her how he loves her as much as the arahants love the Dhamma, cataloging her body parts, the parts he loves as much as the arahants love the Dhamma. You can imagine the Buddha smiling to himself with the thought, this is a totally deluded little diva here. But at the end of this song, he compliments the diva on having written a song where the melody goes well with words, and the words go well with the melody. After all, the Buddha had been a prince, a connoisseur of music, so he would know. Then Sakka comes and asks the Buddha questions about conflict. I don't know if you know this story, but Indian mythology has a story very similar to one in Greek mythology. There's a story of how the Devas fought the Asuras for control of heaven, and finally beat the Asuras just as the Greek gods had to fight the Titans. And so Sakka, having had to wage war even when he was a Deva king, was very concerned about conflict. What are the roots of conflict? He asks. The Buddha traces them back through acquisition, desire, all the way back to papanka or objectification, the type of thinking where you turn yourself into an object and then turn everybody else into an object. As an object or being, you need a place to stay in the world, a place to take the food that will keep you going as a being. So you have to stake out your territory in the world, whether it's physical territory, material territory, emotional territory, even your views. This leads to conflict. After all, as you move into the world, you run into other people, other beings who are involved in the project of objectifying themselves, and they may not like the role that you assign to them. There is conflict right there. Psychologists talk a lot about objectification, how we turn other people into objects, and the Buddha's insight was that we start out by turning ourselves into objects first. To stop the process, we first have to change the way we view ourselves. This is why the path to peace in Kamapasama, as they say in the sutta, starts with right view. Instead of looking at your experience in terms of yourself and other people or the world, i.e., objects in the world, you look at things simply in terms of the Four Noble Truths as stress, its cause, its cessation, and the path leading to its cessation, terms that don't refer to people at all. But each of these terms carries a skill. In the case of stress, you have to comprehend it, which means knowing it so thoroughly, seeing it so thoroughly, that you finally get dispassionate toward it. In the case of the origination of stress, you abandon it, which means not continuing to do it anymore. The cessation of stress is to be witnessed or verified, and the path is to be developed. Each of the Four Noble Truths has 3 levels of knowledge. Knowing the truth, knowing the duty or skill appropriate to the truths, and then knowing that you've completed the duty, mastered the skill. 3 times 4 gives you 12 aspects of the knowledge of awakening, which is what the Dhamma wheel stands for. Back in India, when they combine sets of variables and list all the possible combinations, they would call it a wheel. So this is the Dhamma wheel. And it's interesting that the first sermon is the only place in the whole canon where the Buddha mentions this. It's his most important teaching. You'd think it would be all over the canon. But it's just in the context of this one talk. There are a few reflections on the topic in a few other places, but this is the only place where he sets it out clearly. But it's a teaching we have to keep in mind all the time. This is why he has us divide our experience into the Four Noble Truths, so we can know what to do with whatever comes up. If we still think in terms of selves and the world, our duty is to stake out our part of the world that we claim for the self, and then to defend it. But here he has us look at things in other terms, with other duties. For instance, with stress, if you think of yourself as a self, you don't like having the stress in yourself. You try to get rid of it. But getting rid of it is not the duty under the Four Truths. The duty is to comprehend it, to know it. That requires you to develop the path with the mind in good strong concentration, mindful and alert, imbued with right effort, so you can develop the skill needed to comprehend stress. Because each of the tasks is actually a skill. This is why the path is a gradual path, because it takes a while to develop the skills. After all, Nibbana is very, very subtle. And even though it's immediately present, and the possibility of reaching it is theoretically available at any moment in time, our powers of perception are not up to it, our skills are not skillful enough, not subtle enough. So we have to raise the subtlety of our mind as we develop these skills until finally we reach the level where we can have that sudden awakening into the ultimate peace. The image the Buddha gives is of the continental shelf off of India, a gradual slope out, and then, all of a sudden, a sharp drop. The reason the path has to be both gradual and sudden is because Nibbana is both present and subtle. So we have to gradually develop the subtlety of our minds so that we can then see, oh, it's right here. As the Buddha said, it's something you touch with your body, see with your body. The synesthesia there is interesting. There's no more division among the six senses. There's just an awareness that's outside of the six senses, but it's known right where you had your sense of the body. And that, he says, is the ultimate peace. It causes no harm to anyone. It's a dimension of no objectification at all. Even the question of what happens to you when you reach that doesn't occur anymore, because the you that you created is an object, or the world that you created is a place for objects, applies only as far as the six senses. The concept of there being nothing, no objects, also applies only as far as the six senses. When you move beyond the six senses, those concepts have no more meaning. But right now we still live in the six senses. We're still objectifying. So sometimes the Buddha would answer in an objectifying way the kinds of questions he ordinarily would not answer, such as, what was I in the past? What am I going to be in the future? Ordinarily he would put those questions aside. Yet there are occasional passages in the canon where he talks to people about what they were in the past. But he speaks in ways that are designed to give rise to the sense of dispassion that comes with comprehension, i.e., you see that this really is a lot of suffering. Going through this process of samsaraing is pretty miserable. You've probably heard the comparison of all the water in the oceans as being less than the tears you shed. Well, there's a sutta where the comparison is even more dramatic. He says that all the blood you've lost by having your head cut off is greater than the water in the oceans. The water in the ocean is less than the tears you shed, and it's less than the blood you've lost. He goes through all the different ways you might have lost blood by having your head cut off. For example, when you were a cow, the number of times you've been a cow, and have your cow's head cut off, the amount of blood you've lost from just your cow lives is still greater than all the water in the oceans. The number of times you've been a sheep and had your sheep's head cut off, the blood you lost then is greater than all the water in the oceans. And so on through different beings, different kinds of animals. Then he goes into the times that you were a thief and had your head cut off, the times you were an adulterer or adulteress and had your head cut off. It's an awful lot of blood, and it's an awful lot of miserable existences. Just thinking about the fact that you've been equipped with a cow's head that many times, or a sheep's head that many times, is overwhelmingly dismaying. So he answers the question of what were you in a way that really does lead to dispassion, a comprehension of suffering. This is enough. The sutta states that all the monks who listened to that particular Dhamma talk all became arahants right away because they saw that in objectifying yourself, these are the kinds of objects you come up with. You become a thief, you become a highway robber, you become an adulterer or adulteress, you become cows, sheep, goats, whatnot. There are constant opportunities to objectify yourself in really awful ways. There's constant conflict. The Buddha's insight is that if you learn how to stop objectifying yourself, then you don't turn other people into objects. You can live with them with a lot greater peace. And once you find the peace of Nibbana, you've found a happiness that doesn't require that anybody suffer at all. So this is where we find the ultimate happiness, because it's also the ultimate peace. It's a gift not only to ourselves but also to everyone else, which is why this is such a good path to be on. There is some stress on this path, there are some difficulties in following this path. We haven't totally gotten to the place where we're not placing a burden on other people, and we have to make the effort to be as unburdensome as possible. The simple fact that we're here with a body that needs to be fed, clothed, sheltered, given medicine does place a weight on the world. So there's no real reason why we should want to come back even if we have altruistic reasons, for it still imposes a weight, a burden on other people just to maintain this body. So a happiness that doesn't require that kind of weight or that kind of burden is a very precious thing. And the path leading to that happiness and the peace that comes with it is precious as well. Insight into pain. June 5, 2010. Pain is a fact of consciousness. It's what distinguishes us from robots. Robots can have sensors, but they don't feel pain. It's our main subjective burden, which is why the Buddha's teachings are such a gift. There's a principle in postmodern thought that every attempt to teach people something is an act of aggression, because you're trying to make them submit to your view of things. But the Buddha's teachings are a huge exception to that. He didn't force anybody to accept his teachings. He offered his teachings as therapy. You can take them and use them, or you can put them aside, pay them no mind. He didn't need anyone's approval. He didn't need to exert power over anyone, because he had already found a true happiness that nothing could change. He simply offered his teachings as a gift to the one problem that everybody shares. Now it's true that we don't share one another's pain. I don't feel your pain, you don't feel mine. When a politician says, "I feel your pain," you wonder what he's feeling. But each of us knows what pain is like, and each of us wants a solution to it. The Buddha says that the primary reaction to pain is twofold. One is bewilderment, not understanding where it comes from or why it's there. The second reaction is a search. Is there anyone who knows a way or two to get rid of this pain? Particularly with animals and young children who can't speak yet, there's not much comprehension. There's the sensation of pain, the definite feeling of pain, but there's a huge question that goes along with it. Why? What is this? Why is this happening? That's the bewilderment. As we begin to find that there are other people who can help assuage our pain, starting with our mother and father, we start looking outside. Some pains they can take care of, but a lot of pains they can't. So we look to other people beyond them. The Buddha is there to fill in that gap, because bewilderment often leads to really mistaken ideas, looking to the wrong people, taking up the wrong ideas about how pain can be overcome. So the Buddha gives us his expert advice. He's like a doctor, but not one who simply gives us a shot and sends us home. He's like an old-fashioned herbal doctor who gives you a prescription. It's up to you to find the herbs, make them into medicine, and take it. And you have to adjust your life. Avoiding certain foods, eating other foods, avoiding certain activities, exercising in certain ways. In other words, the actual treatment is up to you. The same with the Buddha. He's not going to take the pain away for you, but he does tell you what you can do to overcome the suffering. In particular, he talks about two kinds of pain, two kinds of suffering. There's the pain in the three characteristics, and there's the pain or suffering in the Four Noble Truths. The pain in the three characteristics is something universal. Wherever there's a process of fabrication where conditions come together to create other conditions, there's going to be stress. The stress inherent in the fact that things arise and pass away, the stress in the fact that they're coming together contains tension and can't be permanent. But that's not the suffering that weighs down the mind. The extent to which it does weigh down the mind comes from the fact that we have craving. The craving is what really weighs us down. That's the suffering, the pain in the Four Noble Truths. That's the type we can do something about. It's optional suffering. And the path to put an end to that optional suffering is the Noble Eightfold Path, or the threefold training. Virtue, concentration, discernment. Virtue here starts with our activities in terms of speech and physical activities. But it points to something really important in the mind. That those activities are based on our intentions. There are several purposes for this aspect of the practice. One is that if you harm others, it's going to be hard for you to practice. The karmic retribution creates difficulties. Then there's the regret you feel when you realize you've harmed yourself or somebody else. As the mind is trying to settle down in concentration, that becomes a thorn in the mind, making it hard to settle down. Training in virtue is a way of avoiding those difficulties. But at the same time, training in virtue is also training in mindfulness, training in alertness, training in compassion, all of which are good qualities of mind you'll have to use in meditation. As you do this, you're getting very sensitive to your intentions because the intention is what determines whether you're breaking a precept or not. We go through life being so ignorant of our intentions and covering them up with denial, especially the unskillful ones. When you ask people why they did something, they often have to stop and think for a little while and reconstruct it. They weren't really there as the decisions were being made. So the precepts try to make you more and more present to your intentions, more sensitive to the results of your actions. Then the same principle gets carried into the mind. When you're practicing concentration, you want to be very clear that this is an action, an activity you're engaged in. You're thinking and evaluating a single object. You're holding a single perception in mind. As the Buddha said, the levels of concentration are a series of perception attainments, all the way from the first jhana up through the dimension of nothingness. At each level, there's a perception you hold in your mind, a mental label you apply to your object. That's what keeps you in touch with the object, such as the breath. There are many things that you could be sensitive to in your awareness of the body right now, but the Buddha's asking that you be sensitive to the dimension of breath energy, the in and out breath and the other breath energies in the body. You try to stay tuned to that level of awareness, that aspect of being sensitive to a physical body sitting here. When the Buddha talks about being aware of the body, he's also getting you to be aware of the four properties: the wind property, the fire property, the water property, and the earth property. These are all aspects of how you sense the body from within. The wind is the energy or motion. Earth is the solidity, fire the warmth, and water the cool sensations that go with the flow of the blood through the body, for example. As you focus on those aspects of your body, you find that there are also feelings of pain or pleasure. It's important that you learn how to distinguish those feelings from the four properties, because otherwise they get glommed together, especially the earth, the solid aspect of the body. When there's a pain, you tend to glom it on with the solid sensations. That makes the pain seem solid and hard. Here is an area where you can get some important insights into how perceptions can create problems. The perception of the pain has glued the pain to the solid sensations of the body, making the pain seem a lot more solid than it actually is. To see this, you have to stay concentrated, to stay with the sense of the body, and not keep flying off to other mental worlds. Then, when you're solidly here, you can start making distinctions. Which sensations are the earth sensations, which ones are the water, fire, breath, or wind? And then which sensations are the pain sensations? They're different things. When you can see that distinction and learn how to apply different labels to those different sensations, you take a huge burden off the mind. Even though there may still be pain in the body, the mind doesn't have to be pained by it. You begin to see that the perception is the bridge between the physical pain and the sense of suffering or being burdened in the mind. How does this perception create craving? Because we lay claim to the body. The whole mass here is us or ours. As soon as pain comes in, our territory has been invaded. We sense the pain is aiming at us. It's trying to do something to us, trying to move in on our space. But if you can practice holding different perceptions of what's going on, there can still be pain, but it's not invading your territory. When you're not trying to take possession of that territory, you're not opening yourself up to attack. So that's another level of perception that you want to be able to distinguish. That when you're aware of something, you also tend to take possession of it. However, it's possible to be aware without having that sense of possession. Just as you're aware of the mountain over there on the horizon, the sun on the mountain, the trees, the chaparral. You look at them and you're aware of them, but there's no sense of possession. They're not yours. As long as mountains and chaparral don't do anything to invade your space, there's no suffering. But if you were to invade them, there would be. If you went out and tried to take possession of Mount Paloma or Mount Pala, there would be problems with the legal owners. But as long as you don't take possession of them, there's no problem. So learn how to apply that same principle to your sense of inhabiting the body. Your awareness can be here, the body can be here, but there doesn't have to be you inhabiting it. There's just the sense of the body that you're aware of. Now, to see the movements of the mind as it's applying these perceptions to things, creating the bridges that allow stress to come into the mind. That requires a lot of stillness, which is why the Buddha said that genuine insights really do require strong concentration. You can have insights about other things without much concentration. You see little movements in the mind here and there in a random kind of way, and draw interesting conclusions. But the insights that really go deep into the mind, that really have an important impact in freeing the mind, are the insights that come from seeing how you're trying to take control of something, so you can gain pleasure out of it, but it turns around and it bites you. As in Ajahn Chah's image, the tail of the snake looks pretty, and the teeth are way on the other end, so we figure that it's safe to grab hold of the tail. It's when you realize that the teeth and the tail are all part of the same body. Those are the insights that are really important, that make a big difference. For those you have to be very quiet, because that movement of mind that tries to take over something, so that you can feel that you're in control of it, convinced that it can lead you to happiness and pleasure. It's so instinctive, so under the radar. There's such an of-courseness about it. Of course you'd think that this is your body, of course you'd feel this way, of course you'd have those perceptions that it's really hard to catch. This is an important aspect of insight. Learning how to question the of course, learning to see things with new eyes, getting out of your old habits of looking and understanding, and then turning around to look at those old habits. Oh my gosh, they really do cause a lot of unnecessary suffering and stress. So an important aspect of concentration practice is learning to get out of your old habits. Instead of thinking about things as you normally do or focusing on things as you normally would, try to hold on to your perception of the breath regardless. The mind may say, "This is stupid, you're not getting any insights," but you can say, "Sorry, whether it's stupid or not, I don't care. I'm just going to keep on doing this." You're here to learn something new. As the Buddha said, you're practicing to realize what you haven't realized before, to attain what you haven't attained before, and that means you have to do things you haven't done before. So you stick with the breath regardless of how tempting it may be to go thinking about other things, focusing on other things. You stay right here, right here, right here. Develop the strength of mind that can stick with something regardless. The image Ajahn Fuang used was of a red ant. In Thailand they have big red ants that bite so tenaciously that if you try to pull them off, sometimes their heads detach before their jaws will let go. That, he said, is the kind of tenacity you want as you're sticking with the breath, because it rearranges priorities in the mind. The part of the mind that says, "I'm bored. I'd like to think about something else." You have to say no to it. No, 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 just stay right here. In doing that, you get the mind out of its normal conversations, its normal ways of doing things and approaching things. Only when you get out of your normal ways can you turn around and look at your normal ways and get some perspective on them, to see that even though the pains of conditions are a normal part of the world, the suffering that the mind takes on is totally optional. It's because of our own lack of skill that we suffer. So this is why discernment is so crucial for seeing the distinctions between things we otherwise glom together, glomming the pain onto the solid parts of the body, glomming some me onto that pain in the solid parts of the body so that it's all a big solid sticky mess. When you learn how to distinguish things, make distinctions, see the differences, say that a feeling of pleasure or pain is not the same thing as a sense of solidity, or that being aware of the body doesn't mean that you have to lay claim to the body, there can be a sense of separation between the mind and its object. When you can see these distinctions, that's how release comes. After all, the threefold training is not the end of the story. The end of the story is the fourth of what the Buddha called the Four Noble Dhammas: virtue, concentration, discernment, and release. These four noble dhammas give a more complete picture of what we're about here than you get from just the list of the triple training. We're here for release. You recognize discernment as genuine discernment by what it does. It brings release. You see something radically different, something you didn't see before. You understand something you didn't understand before, and in the understanding, there's a release from suffering. That's the kind of insight we're looking for. Other insights may be useful along the way, but you don't want to stop with them. This is one of the reasons why Ajahn Fuang said not to go around memorizing your insights, because if the insight is genuine, it brings freedom right there. It does something. It's not just information. It's an insight that makes a difference, serves a purpose, accomplishes something. That's when the discernment is noble and leads to noble release. Metta means goodwill. March 9, 2011. Every morning, every night here at the monastery, we repeat a metta chant, expressing goodwill, limitless goodwill, for ourselves and all other beings. And there's a reason why we do it so often. It's part of the motivation for why we practice. We want to find true happiness. We want to make sure that we act on the intention not to harm anyone in the course of finding that happiness. There are two reasons for wanting to keep this intention, a desire for harmless happiness, uppermost in our minds. The first is that if our happiness depends on somebody else's suffering, it's not going to last. They'll do what they can to destroy it. The second reason is the plain quality of sympathy. If you see someone suffering, it's painful. It's hard to feel happy when you know that that happiness is causing suffering for others. But developing goodwill for everybody doesn't come naturally. It takes work because there are a lot of people out there who are doing hurtful, despicable things. It's hard to feel friendly toward them. So we have to sit down and think about why we might want to have goodwill for them. First, we gave to understand the quality of goodwill itself. There are 3 places in the canon where the Buddha recommends what you might call metta phrases for directing thoughts of goodwill. These are a good guide for gaining a clear idea of what metta means. One is that set we chant every day. May all living beings be happy, free from stress and pain, free from animosity, free from oppression, free from trouble. May they look after themselves with ease. Notice that last statement. May they look after themselves with ease. We're not saying that we're going to be there for them all the time. And most beings would be happier knowing that they could depend on themselves rather than having to depend on others. I once heard a Dharma teacher say that he wouldn't want to live in a world where there was no suffering, because then he wouldn't be able to express his compassion, which, you think about it, is an extremely selfish wish. You need other people to suffer so you can feel good about expressing your compassion. The best attitude to have is, may all beings be happy. May they be able to look after themselves with ease. That way they can have the happiness of independence and self-reliance. Another set of metta phrases is in the Karaniya Metta Sutta. They start out by saying, may all beings be happy at heart, whether they are long or short, big or little, strong or weak, but then they go on to say, may no one harm anyone else or despise anyone else or wish them harm. In saying these phrases, you not only wish for beings to be happy, but you also wish that they avoid the actions that would lead to bad karma, to their own unhappiness. You honor the principle that happiness has to depend on action. For people to find true happiness, they have to understand the causes for happiness and act on them. So again, you're not saying that you're going to be there for them all the time. You're hoping that people will wise up and be there for themselves. The Karaniya Metta Sutta goes on to say, when you're practicing this, you want to protect this attitude in the same way that a mother would protect her only child. Some people who misread that, thinking that they're supposed to cherish all living beings the same way a mother would cherish her only child. But that's not what the Buddha is saying. He's saying that you try to protect your goodwill as a mother would protect her only child, looking after it all the time, making sure that it doesn't waver. Because again, you don't want to harm anybody. It's usually during those waverings that the harm happens, so you do everything you can to protect this attitude. So, as the Buddha says toward the end of this sutta, You should stay determined to practice this form of mindfulness. The mindfulness of keeping in mind your wish that all beings be happy, to make sure that it always informs the motivation for everything you do. Finally, there's another passage where the Buddha taught the monks a chant for spreading goodwill to all snakes and other creeping things. The story goes that a monk meditating in a forest was bitten by a snake and died. The monks reported this to the Buddha, and he replied that if that monk had spread goodwill to all 4 great families of snakes, the snake wouldn't have bitten him. Then the Buddha teaches the monks the chant for expressing metta for all snakes, and not only for snakes, but also for all footless beings, 2-footed beings, 4-footed beings, many-footed beings. May all beings, whether they have no feet or 2 feet or 4 feet or many feet, meet with happiness, may they be free from suffering. Then he goes through a list of all kinds of creeping things. Rats, snakes, scorpions, lizards. May they all be happy. May they meet with good fortune. And may they go away. In other words, this expression of metta takes into consideration the truth that living together is often difficult, especially for beings of different species that can harm one another, and the happiest thing for both sides may often be to live apart. Ajahn Fuang, my teacher, once discovered that a snake had moved into his room. So for 3 days they lived together. He was very careful not to startle the snake or make it feel threatened by his presence. But finally, on the 3rd day, as he was sitting in meditation, he addressed the snake quietly in his mind. He said, "Look, it's not that I don't like you. I don't have any bad feelings for you. But our minds work in different ways. It'd be very easy for there to be a misunderstanding between us. There are lots of places out in the woods where you can live without the uneasiness of living with me." So he sat there, spreading goodwill to the snake, and the snake left. These different ways of expressing goodwill show that goodwill is not necessarily the quality of loving-kindness. You're not there to cherish these beings or to look after them. You wish them well, sometimes realizing that the best thing for everybody would be to live separately, with each of us understanding the causes for happiness, and each being able to look after him or herself with ease. This is an attitude you can extend to everybody, regardless of how much you like or dislike them, or of how good or bad their current behavior. If we were told to love everybody and to want to be kind to everybody, to look after them, there are a lot of people out there that are pretty unlovable. The Buddha is not asking you to love them, just to wish them well. May they be happy. May they understand the causes for happiness. May they avoid the kind of behavior that causes suffering. May they look after themselves with ease. That way the whole world could be at peace. Although these are good attitudes to develop at all times, the Buddha recommends 2 situations where they're especially important to develop. One is when you're being harmed by other people, or feeling threatened with harm. You try to develop an attitude of goodwill for those people, and then, starting with them, you spread that attitude out to encompass the entire universe of beings. Try, the Buddha says, to make your mind as large as the river Ganges, or as large as the earth, in other words, larger than the harm they're doing or threatening to do to you. May they be happy. May they stop causing suffering. May they stop suffering themselves. You're taught to think in this way so that you don't react in unskillful ways to their unskillful behavior. Another time the Buddha recommends developing an attitude of infinite goodwill is when you realize that you've harmed others. You realize, he says, that getting tied up in remorse is not going to undo the harm. So remorse is no help. If you tie yourself up in remorse, it's very easy for you to weaken yourself and as a result, end up doing harm to others again. So you simply note the fact that what you did was a mistake, and then you wish that person well. Then you wish all beings well, as a way of helping to guarantee that you would never again intentionally try to cause harm. And then you have to act on that determination. You can't just stop with that wish and then pretend that you've taken care of everything. You've got to look at the situations in which you live. You have to keep your thoughts of goodwill in mind. Where do you tend to cause harm? Is it through your words? Is it through your actions? How can you act in different ways? How can you speak in different ways? In other words, try to be a fair judge of your actions. If you see that your instinctive way of reacting to the situation is unskillful, sit down and ask yourself, what would be a more skillful way of handling the situation the next time it comes? This fits in with the Buddha's teachings on preventing unskillful states from arising. These are times when you really do have to think about the past and think about the future, i.e., where you've made a mistake in the past and what you can do in the future not to repeat it. The same principle applies to observing the precepts. Once you know that you're not going to kill anything, you have to sit down and look at your house. How can you arrange things in your house so that you're not attracting ants, cockroaches, or whatever? Don't treat these pests as a surprise when they come. They are things you can anticipate. So it's a useful exercise to sit down and look at your life to figure out in what ways can you be less harmful. If situation X were to arise, how can you prepare yourself ahead of time so that you don't respond in your old unskillful ways? This teaches you to be meticulous, scrupulous in following your wish for all beings to find happiness, true happiness. In other words, your goodwill, to be most effective both inside and out, can't be just a floating sort of general idea. You have to apply it to the nitty-gritty of all your interactions with others. This way your goodwill becomes honest. And it actually does have an impact, which is why we develop this attitude to begin with. To make sure that it actually does animate our thoughts, our words, and our deeds. As the Buddha said, the development of goodwill is one of causes for true happiness, a happiness that's good for everybody. And that kind of happiness is really special. All too often, the pleasures of the world require that if somebody's gaining, other people have to lose. But with this cause for happiness, everybody gains. So develop it as much as you can. As we conclude this final episode, we extend our heartfelt gratitude for your listenership. Yet, our journey doesn't end here. Just as Buddha implored sharing his teachings, we invite your active engagement. Aid in spreading these invaluable insights universally by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Your involvement ensures these teachings echo far and wide, nurturing positive transformation and empathy. Your continued presence in future episodes is eagerly anticipated as we unite to illuminate minds and cultivate compassion worldwide. Thank you for being part of this enlightening endeavor. Together, let's keep the flame of wisdom burning bright.